Today on Tiny Voices, we're gonna crunch some numbers and look at the raid content of World of Warcraft. Spreadsheets and MMOs like butter and toast. Two days ago at Gamescom, Blizzard announced details about World of Warcraft's 6th expansion, Legion, themed around the Burning Legion. They announced a new class, the Demon Hunters. They talked about some new features coming to the game. They showed concept art and talked about dungeons and raids and PvP. Nothing out of the ordinary so far, aside from the fact that they chose to announce the new expansion at Gamescom in Cologne, Germany, instead of their own annual convention, BlizzCon. But something stood out to me. In particular, it was this.
Raids. So, for raids, we're actually pretty happy with how the overall structure in Warlords of Draenor played out.
That statement's almost treated like a footnote, but it's actually pretty important. The upcoming Legion expansion is going to feature a similar raid structure to the current expansion, Warlords of Draenor, which consisted of only 3 raids. That came as a surprise to me because WoW over time has slowly expanded its scope and variety of content, from leveling alts to doing dailies, to leveling more alts, reputation grinding, battlegrounds, arenas, pet battle, garrisons, leveling more alts on different servers because you don't have any more room on your current server for more alts, and more. But WoW's biggest content draw has always arguably been raiding. It's been a foundation of WoW ever since day one. Molten Core and Onyxia's Lair have been around since WoW's release on November 23, 2004, over 10 years ago. In fact, vanilla WoW consisted of 67 bosses spread across 8 different raids that were released across nearly a year and a half. Warlords of Draenor comparatively consisted of only 30 bosses across 3 raids, released over a little more than half a year apart. As someone who's always enjoyed WoW's raid content above and beyond anything else in the game, it was dismaying to hear that Warlords of Draenor's relative lack of content would be the norm going forward. This got me curious, so I started to look at the numbers expansion by expansion. Now, as I already said, Classic WoW consisted of 67 bosses across 8 different raids. I also looked at the drought periods where no new raid content was available. Before I go into that, I want to offer a quick caveat. I deemed a raid complete once the world first kill of the final boss occurred. This is bound to slightly skew the data toward the bleeding edge of competitive raiders as opposed to groups that raid casually and likely complete the available content much more slowly. The reason I did this is because it's honestly the most reliable available data. So when I say that Molten Core took 154 days to clear, what I mean is that 154 days after Molten Core was released, Ragnaros, the final boss of the dungeon, was killed for the first time ever. Additionally, some raids aren't included in this specific dataset because, again, it's difficult to find reliable information about their completion. This includes Zul'Gurub, Upper Blackrock Spire, and the 20-man version of Encourage in Classic, along with Karazhan and Zul'Aman for the Burning Crusade. So again, just keep that in mind. This is going to skew some of the completion data just slightly, at least for Vanilla and the Burning Crusade. Good, with that out of the way, Classic WoW launched with 2 raids, Molten Core and Onyxia. Onyxia took 69 days to clear, while Molten Core took 154 days to clear. Molten Core was cleared on April 25th, 2005, and the next major raid was Blackwing Lair, BWL, which was released on July 12th, 2005. BWL was cleared for the first time 77 days after release on September 26th, 2005. Between the completion of Molten Core and BWL, there was a lengthy 78-day gap, where no new raid content was released. On the other hand, there was only a gap of about 38 days between the end of BWL and the release of Encourage 40. The final major raid of Classic WoW was released on June 20th, 2006, and it was Naxxramas, consisting of 15 bosses, and it lasted roughly 3 months before being cleared. With Naxxramas cleared, 131 days passed before the release of the Burning Crusade. In total, 784 days passed between the release of Classic WoW and its first expansion. That, combined with the relative difficulty of the content, along with resistance gear grinding and other types of gear grinds, meant that very few people during the period of Classic WoW went without raid content for very long. The Burning Crusade, which was the game's first expansion, launched with even more raid content than Classic WoW. 5 of the expansion's 9 total raids were available more or less immediately. That includes the 10-man Karazhan, along with Gruul's Lair, Magtheridon's Lair, Serpent Shrine Caverns, and Tempest Keep. It should be noted that several of these raids required attunements, which are quest chains that prohibited entry into the raids until completion, which made them functionally unavailable for a short period of time. What's even more interesting about the Burning Crusade, though, is that Black Temple was made available before any guild in the world was able to clear Serpent Shrine Caverns and Tempest Keep. There was functionally no gap there, no downtime, no drought. The specific circumstances of why involved some glitched final encounters and attunement processes, but it's impressive nonetheless that there was no clear drought in content from the Burning Crusade's release on January 16, 2007, through Black Temple's release on May 15th of that year. In fact, the only content drought in the Burning Crusade came between the end of Black Temple and the release of the Burning Crusade's final raid, Sunwell Plateau. 294 days passed in the interim, most of which players spent thinking Black Temple would be the final raid of the expansion. Another 233 days would pass between the first kill of Sunwell Plateau's final boss, Kill Jaden, and the release of WoW's second expansion, Wrath of the Lich King. The total time between the Burning Crusade and Wrath of the Lich King was 667 days. The Burning Crusade consisted of more raids with only slightly fewer bosses than Classic. If you include Zul'Aman and Karazhan, there were 51 bosses spread across 9 different raids. Wrath of the Lich King was finally released on November 13, 2008. It's in this expansion that WoW's subscriber base not only peaked, but remained most consistent. It consisted of only slightly fewer raids and raid bosses than previous iterations of WoW, 7 and 49 respectively, but introduced a brand new concept, hard mode and heroic raids, content with flexible difficulty levels that could be adjusted almost on the fly. It can be argued that its raid content was distributed more evenly than the Burning Crusades, more in line with the release of Classic's raid content. The shortest gap between raids and Wrath of the Lich King was 28 days between the end of Ulduar and the beginning of the trial of the Grand Crusader. Now, that gap would be slightly longer if not for a surprise kill of the hardest version of the dungeon's final boss by a Taiwanese guild. The kill came as a result of a very creative strategy, and prior to this kill, the boss was thought to be mathematically impossible without some fine-tuning. Anyway, the longest drought between raids and Wrath of the Lich King was between the release of Trial of the Grand Crusader and Icecrown Citadel, resulting in 155 days of downtime for raiders. Wrath of the Lich King also featured the second shortest wait from the end of the expansion's final raid to the release of the next expansion, Cataclysm, at 160 days. Cataclysm, WoW's third expansion, continued a downward trend in the amount of available raid content throughout the expansion. Only 28 bosses across 5 raids, nearly half of the content of the Burning Crusade. Up to this point, the average wait between raids was 57 days during Classic and 102 during Wrath. The Burning Crusade's average gap between raids was 294 days, but I consider it a statistical outlier, as the only gap was the 294-day wait between the end of Black Temple and Sunwell Plateau, which makes it nigh impossible to identify a trend from only one data point. On the other hand, during Cataclysm, the average wait, drought, downtime, whatever you want to call it, between raids was 144 days, the shortest gap being 133 days between the end of Firelands and the release of Dragon Soul, and the longest being 155 days. To reiterate, the shortest amount of time that raiders had to wait for new content to be released in Cataclysm was 133 days. Some of the emerging trends become much more pronounced with the release of Mists of Pandaria, which left a lengthy 280-day drought between the end of Cataclysm's final raid and Mist's own launch date of December 7, 2010. Mists of Pandaria would again feature 5 raids with only 43 bosses. What's more, Mists of Pandaria was the very first WoW expansion ever to launch with no available raid content. But in its defense, the content drip was much more consistent throughout most of the expansion. Mogashin Vaults, the very first raid of the expansion, was released a week after Mists launched, and it was first cleared on October 12, 2012. The next raid was then released on the 30th of the same month. That trend continued for most of the expansion. Heart of Fear was released on the 30th of October and cleared on the 11th of November. Terrace of Endless Springs was released 2 days later on the 13th of November. That was cleared on the 25th, and the next raid was available in March of 2013. Mist's only significant drought came between the end of Throne of Thunder and the release of Siege of Orgrimmar. 152 days, which in the grand scheme of things isn't actually that out of the ordinary. What was out of the ordinary was the 408-day wait between the first clear of heroic Siege of Orgrimmar and the release of WoW's current expansion, Warlords of Draenor. Over a year and some change passed with no newly released raid content at all, which is flabbergasting considering how relatively little content was made available during this expansion. Finally, we come to WoW's current expansion, Warlords of Draenor. Warlords thus far has consisted of 30 bosses spread across just 3 different raids, approaching record lows on both fronts if not for the relatively few bosses of Cataclysm. Based on statements from Blizzard, prospects of getting an additional raid this tier are pretty low. Even with this small amount of content, there have been lengthy gaps where no new content was released. 123 days passed between the end of Blackrock Foundry and the release of Hellfire Citadel. Despite having so little content, the average gap between raids in Warlords of Draenor was 64 days. That's more than Classic, which featured substantially more raid content. And to bring this full circle, during Gamescom, Blizzard stated they were happy with Warlords of Draenor's 3-raid structure. Additionally, they've often stated how they want to release more expansions more frequently, and they appear to be targeting early next year for Legion's release. That's based purely on conjecture and a bit of common sense. They said at Gamescom that Legion would be entering beta later this year. WoW's betas usually run for about 2 to 3 months prior to the expansion's release. The earliest Legion could release going by that would be around early 2016, which by the way would still leave a 170 plus day gap with no new content between the end of this expansion and the release of the next one. But here's the kicker. WoW's first 4 expansions released with a price tag of $40 each. Warlords was released for $50. There's no real sense in speculating on what Legion's price tag will be when it comes out, so we'll just restrict this part to the currently released expansions. What we have here is a clear trend. 1, every expansion has reduced the amount of available raid content. The most recent ones have featured dramatically less than the earlier ones. 2, having less content hasn't actually addressed the lengthy droughts where no new content is available. The gaps between the end of the raid content for one expansion and the release of the next expansion have been skyrocketing ever since around Cataclysm. 3, the price of buying an expansion for WoW has mostly been on a plateau, but it's recently gone up. Granted, this may be a one-time spike, but that doesn't change the fact that Warlords of Draenor offered as little raid content as ever for a higher price than previous expansions. 4, Blizzard is happy with the amount of raid content in Warlords of Draenor and wants to release expansions faster. To sum that up, if your primary interest in WoW is raiding, over time you're expected to pay more for less content with longer droughts, and Blizzard wants to sell you expansions with less content more frequently while maintaining a monthly subscription fee. The value proposition of WoW expansions has tanked if you're primarily interested in raiding. Between a dwindling subscriber base and more varieties of content than ever taking a larger slice of the pie away from raiding, you can almost understand why some of these trends are occurring. Not everything has to revolve around the raider demographic of the game. It just doesn't help the value proposition if you still view raiding as WoW's foundation. Again, if raiding is the main thing hooking you into WoW, then Blizzard's only made it harder and harder to justify the cost of entry. That's gonna do it for this week. Hope I didn't lose you in a haze of numbers early on, and more importantly, I hope you got something out of this. I think I was pretty upfront about my bias towards raiding here, and I hope that bias didn't spin this too hard, but I wanted to address the topic of WoW's lack of raid content over time, or rather how that content has kind of dwindled and petered off, because it was the main thing that kept me coming back to WoW for such a long time and watching streams of progression raids even when I wasn't subscribed. Again, this has been episode 2 of a 6-episode initial run of Tiny Voices, which is still very much an experimental little beast of mine. Next week's topic will again be something totally different that we take a deep dive into. If you have any feedback or suggestions for topics, once again, I'd love to hear all that stuff in the comments, because your feedback is what's going to shape and mold this show and help me smooth out the rough edges. Thanks for watching, everyone. Take it easy. Have a good one.